Hey AP Psych students, it's Megan with Fiveable here tonight to go over with you Abnormal Part 2. Just a reminder, with Fiveable, we're on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. Make sure to follow us to get information, updates, and any cool study tips and things like that. As I said, we are in the abnormal unit. Last week, we talked a little bit about the historical approach to abnormal psychology, and then we focused on all of the different anxiety disorders. This unit's a pretty big unit. It's 7 to 9% of the AP exam. And today, like I said, we will be covering all kind of other mental illnesses, which is a pretty big, broad category. The good news is you don't have to know a ton of in-depth information about a lot of these disorders. Mostly understanding the symptoms and how they're diagnosed would be sufficient for the AP test. You don't need to know a ton of things about what causes them and things like that. As always, on the bottom of your screen, there are some tabs, and you can ask a question, things like that down there, or you can ask a question in the chat. It looks like Luisa just asked one. So before we jump in, I'm gonna quick answer that question. Luisa says, I'm taking AP Psych. My teacher said we won't be done with content until 1 week before the AP test. Any advice on studying to make sure you pass? I would say I would start now, just flipping through your vocab from whatever units are from the beginning of the year. So you don't have to spend hours studying, but I would suggest getting either on, what's the website with the flashcards? Quizlet. Getting on Quizlet. There's a lot of really good Quizlets out there for AP Psych, or, doing whatever you did for your vocab and just reviewing that. I think that's the key to start kind of refreshing your mind now so that you don't have to cram with 1 week to go. So maybe pick 1 unit a week or 2 units a week and just flip through them once or twice. That's what I would do. Also, there's a lot of good practice questions out there online. That's another really good way to start studying. So I would say starting now, you can study in smaller doses and then you can feel more confident going into test day. All right. So the first kind of strand of disorders then that we're going to cover today are mood disorders. And the definition, I guess, of a mood disorder is any kind of condition that's characterized by extremes in mood, so really high highs or really low lows. And then those have to spill over and disrupt your social processes, your perceptual processes, your thought processes. So we all have like really high highs once in a while, right? We get really excited about something great happens, or the opposite, something really bad happens. But if it's not continually spilling over into our everyday lives and being disruptive, remember, for something to be a psychological disorder, it has to be dysfunctional and disruptive. So there's 2 main mood disorders that you have to know for AP Psych. The first is major depressive disorder, and that's characterized by lethargy and hopelessness, and we'll talk more about that on future slides. And then the other is bipolar disorder, which is an alternation between that depressive, that really down, low state, and the really high. So yeah, those are the 2 that fall under the umbrella, kind of is called mood disorders, and then under the umbrella is major depressive and bipolar. So mood disorders, depression, there's a really good video. It came out a couple years ago. Maybe you've seen it making the rounds on social media, but it's called I Had a Black Dog. His name was Depression. I'm not going to show it because it's like 5 minutes long, so I don't want to waste too much of our time, but I would highly recommend watching it. I think it's like a cartoon kind of written by someone who suffers from depression. And I think it gives a really good idea of really what depression is. It's not just being sad. And that's a common misconception that you kind of need to be able to clear your mind from. It's not just being sad. And it's really just like this oppressive kind of weight that impacts all parts of your life. Losing interest in doing things, being tired all of the time. And what I think is interesting is this statistic here. 29% of American high school students felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 or more weeks in a row that they stopped doing their usual activities. So depression is a super common psychological disorder that we talk about, and it really impacts kids your age all of the time. And so I think understanding it is a really helpful first step for us. And then about 13% of US adults also suffer from it. You don't really need to know those percentages. We're just kind of setting the stage here so that you kind of realize that it's very common and very widespread. The other thing that I like to do is look at specifically the difference between having a depressed mood, just kind of general depression, versus having a major depressive disorder. And so depressed mood is common. This just general depression, we all probably experience it at some point in our lives. People, about 1 in 4 people with depressed mood have experienced such a loss, like losing your job obviously could be really stressful and cause you to be depressed. Death of a loved one, going through a breakup with a relationship, all of those different things could cause depression. But it doesn't become like major depressive disorder unless it really is long lasting, it's pervasive, and it doesn't go away on its own, typically speaking. And our bodies actually can put us into a depressive state from like an evolutionary perspective. It kind of protects us because when we are depressed, it slows our bodies down, it refocuses our energy, and it allows us to move forward. And so some evolutionary psychologists would argue that that is the purpose of when we all kind of get into those sort of funks once in a while. But if it goes further and it continues into this deeper sort of depression, that's when we would become even more concerned. And so I'm putting this up here. It's a self-rating depression scale. If you've ever been to a therapist, you've possibly taken this. I have all of my students take it. Again, I'm not going to sit here for 10 minutes and have you look at it, but I would love it if everyone like screenshotted it or took a picture of it and just went through it on their own. A little self-reflection, I think, is pretty good, especially when we saw that statistic about how common depression is among teenagers. And basically 1 is something that you don't feel hardly ever, and 5 is a feeling that you have all of the time. And so what you would do is you would take this test or this quiz, and then you'd tally up your total. A score of 50 to 59 hints that there might be mild depression kind of lurking there. And so you might want to think about like possibly seeking out therapy or seeing your primary care doctor or thinking about changes you could make in your life. A score above 60 indicates more of a moderate risk of depression. And if you have a score above 70, then you really should probably be seeking out a counselor, your parent, doctor, some extra help because that puts you at a really high risk or a high indicator of depression. So take a screenshot, do this later in your free time, but I have my students do this. I think it's important just to self-reflect. So if you are scoring quite high, or people who do score quite high on this may have, it's not a guarantee, right? It's just an indicator, but they may have what we call then major depressive disorder. And that's when just that depressed mood or that down feeling really becomes maladaptive. It really impacts your life. You have a hard time just functioning on a day-to-day basis. Major depressive disorder is not caused by drugs or medical conditions. Their cause is typically partially to do with brain chemistry, partially to do with social circumstances, things like that. And for, again, it to reach what we would consider that major depressive disorder, it also has to last for 2 or more weeks. So it's not just you're sad because your boyfriend broke up with you, but you're going to kind of just eventually get over that on your own. This is something more pervasive than that. And then typically for your doctor to diagnose you with major depressive order, you'd have to meet 2 or more of the following symptoms as well: depressed mood most of the day, diminished pleasure in activities, weight loss or weight gain, decrease or increase in appetite, those kind of go together, too much sleeping or insomnia. And so really depression can be tricky because sleeping too much, but then also having insomnia, those are kind of opposites, but both of those could be indicators for major depressive disorder. So that is one of the ways that doctors diagnose major depressive order, talking to you, kind of checking off that scale. I know now, even when I go to the doctor, they always kind of check through these questions with you, and they're just doing a quick little self-scale or a self-indicator to check kind of where you're at. Even when I'm not going for like therapy, I'm just going for like my yearly checkup or whatever. So just some other facts about major depressive disorder. Women are twice as likely as men to have major depression. Most major depressive episodes do eventually self-terminate, so it's not necessarily something that you're sentenced with for the rest of your lives. You may have bouts of it on and off, but typically it does ease eventually and go away, depending on how you treat it and what sorts of things you're seeking out. We also are seeing a change in how and when depression strikes. It's striking earlier and affecting people your age more and more, and even younger, middle schoolers, elementary school kids. There could be a variety of factors there, changing social norms, social media, the internet, things like that. Just this constant bombardment that you guys have with different messages and media can really be stressful at times. And there's a new-ish diagnosis that's come out in recent years called persistent depressive disorder. And this is experiencing a mildly depressed mood for at least 2 years. So like major depressive disorders, like, gosh, I can't get out of bed, I can't eat, I can't sleep, those sorts of things. Persistent depressive disorder, you're still probably going out about your lives, but it's just kind of difficult. You're tired. You just don't feel great. You don't ever feel super happy or things like that for like 2 years. So that's more of a long-term, consistent diagnosis, whereas major depressive disorder would be a little more short-term than that. So it kind of builds, like just a depressed mood is one thing. Major depressive disorder is obviously above that, and it's kind of deeper, longer lasting. And then there's persistent depressive disorder, which is much longer lasting, but maybe not as like deeply affected as the others. And so one of the problems that happens with depression is that it's not just a psychological thing. It's not just a biological thing. There's a lot of factors at play. And so there's typically a vicious cycle that emerges where, let's say something negative or stressful happens in your life. Let's say that your girlfriend broke up with you. And so you are going to interpret that in a pessimistic way. Gosh, nobody loves me. No one's ever going to love me. That's how you feel when your significant other breaks up with you. That creates a hopeless and depressed state where you might be sad and grumpy and not very friendly and outgoing because you don't feel great, right? And so then that depressed mood impacts the way you think and act. And you think, well, that new girl could never like me. I'm just a loser and nobody likes me. And then your attitude then causes you to have more negative and stressful experiences, which just starts this kind of cycle over and over again. And so a lot of times with therapy, which we'll see next unit, there's a lot about just changing those thought processes and breaking out of those cycles to kind of interpret events and situations in new ways so you can break that circle of negative experiences, negative thoughts, negative actions, that sort of thing. And then I just like that quote. The difference between a blue mood after bad news and a mood disorder is like the difference between gasping for breath after a hard run and being chronically short of breath. So, right, we all, if we were to go sprint around the block, we'd all be short of breath. We'd be gasping. But in a few minutes, our breathing would return to normal. That's like people who have a bad mood, right? It goes away sooner rather than later. But people with a major depressive disorder are constantly breathing heavy. They just can't catch their breath. They just can't quite catch up and feel quote unquote normal, right? And I think that's a good illustration of the difference between just a depressed mood and an actual depressive disorder. All right. The other mood disorder then that we need to talk about is bipolar disorder. And this is when we see people alternating between two states. There's a depressive state, which is going to be very similar to what we just talked about. It's basically depression. But then it's paired with a manic state. And the manic state is like a really high. It's you might be hyperactive fast. You may be really optimistic, prone to just getting in your car and driving to Vegas, making rash decisions, things like that. You have lower inhibitions. You might be louder, hard to interrupt, all of those things. And it's actually hypothesized that a lot of creativity seen by like artists, musicians, and writers may be fueled from minor bipolar disorder, people who go into a state of just wild creativity and create these masterpieces might be being fueled by this manic state. And so one of the common misconceptions that you really need to understand about bipolar disorder is it's not just like flipping a switch on and off. You're not just depressed and then euphoric and then depressed and then manic and depressed and manic. These states last for long periods of time, typically a couple days, couple weeks, couple months, even it could be like a couple years. So, you know, if someone's like, oh, you're so bipolar, that's first of all not something nice to say, because we shouldn't use mental illness as an insult, but also it's not accurate. It's not this idea of how your moods flip-flop, because typically, like we said, with bipolar disorder, you may reach a depressive state and that could last for weeks or months or even years. It's not a flip-flop back and forth, typically speaking. So make sure you understand that, because that is a very common misconception. We also have a newer diagnosis more for young people, as we're seeing this disorder emerge at younger and younger age. And typically we try to not diagnose people with bipolar disorder as children. And so instead of using the label bipolar disorder, there's something called disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, and that's used for young people to kind of monitor how that progresses into adulthood. All right. So briefly, we touch, and your book touches on suicide, or at least my textbook does. I do want to talk about this just given the rising rates, and I think it's important for people your age to hear about this. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the U.S. In my state, it is the 2nd leading cause of death in Wisconsin for young people, besides accidents. And so in the last few years, suicide rates have really skyrocketed. There's a lot of hypotheses about that, but basically it's important to know just a few of these things. Women are more likely to actually attempt suicide. However, men are more likely to complete the act of suicide. And so basically women tend to use what we would call more passive methods, things like pills, where they have a better chance of being saved after they've attempted the suicide act. And men tend to use more violent methods like guns. And so they tend to actually complete the act more often. A sad statistic is that 90% of people who do complete suicide have some kind of psychological disorder. 60% have a mood disorder. So we know that there's risk factors there for people with psychological disorders. We also know like our LGBT friends are more at risk because of social factors and everyday things that happen. We also know that we can help prevent suicide by using environmental barriers, guns, reducing access to firearms, so keeping them locked away where young people can't access them, putting barriers on bridges, things that can reduce the impulsive act of suicide have been proven successful. And then on there, I did put there's 2 different methods. If you ever feel like you need help, or if you know a friend needs help, it's important to reach out. It's a common misconception that talking about suicide actually makes someone think more about it or completing it. That's just not true. So don't be afraid to, make sure your friends or family or yourself is okay. There's a help hotline to call, or if you're more of a texter, you can text TALK to 74141. They have services there to help you as well. So just maybe jot that down, something useful to save. Someday you may need that for yourself or a friend. All right. Another thing that tends to align with mood disorders is what we call non-suicidal self-injury, which most people just refer to as cutting. Peak risk for this is teenage girls. And the reason why we talk about this is often, it is not necessarily an indicator of suicide, but people who do cut have a higher risk for suicide later on. And so if you know someone who cuts or things like that, again, maybe important to check in with them or talk to an adult, get them some help, because there are risk factors at play there. So we talked about mood disorders at length, but now how do we understand where they come from? Well, first there's the biological factors. Certain disorders have a high heritability. So you can see on that chart there that some genetic predispositions, things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and anorexia, interestingly enough. Those are all highly heritable traits. So we know there's genetic factors at play that explain why one person versus another may experience one of these disorders. We also have witnessed that there are actual brain differences. The left frontal lobe and the hippocampus do look different in people who suffer from mood disorders. So we know there's some actual brain structural things at play there. And then most definitely, there's neurochemical factors, especially with the neurotransmitters norepinephrine and serotonin. They play a role in having too low levels of those can play a role in some of these disorders. And we'll talk more about that in the therapy unit when we talk about treating them, because those chemical factors are what we do with medications and stuff like that. So from a biological perspective, there's a lot of reasons why some people may suffer from a mood disorder: chemical differences, brain difference, genetic difference. There's also social and cognitive factors. So having a negative explanatory style, we already talked about that, but just having this like, oh my gosh, everybody hates me now that my boyfriend broke up with me, I'll never be happy again, like having that sort of a viewpoint. Those cognitive factors make you more prone to having a mood disorder. Stress is another factor, learned helplessness, those sorts of things can all play a role. So it's not just biological factors, there's life stressors and things like that as well. And we'll talk more about, again, how to kind of deal with those things in the therapy unit, the way that they're looked at, the way that they're treated. All right, so we are done with mood disorders. We're going to do a brief overview now of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, the word, literally means split mind. And basically, schizophrenia is a psychological disorder. And how we determine it is based on a person's delusions, hallucinations. You may have disorganized speech, so you just like would be kind of speaking gibberish and like I wouldn't be able to understand you. And you would also experience a diminished or inappropriate emotional responses. So not reacting to really sad or really happy news, or laughing at a funeral, things like that. Those sorts of things may be indicators of schizophrenia. Obviously not just on their own, like we all have awkward situations or things like that, but in general, that's one of the indicators that we look at to determine if someone has schizophrenia. And so the big thing, just some facts about schizophrenia. First and foremost, it is one of the most dreaded disorders because it's really hard to like cure or fix. So if people are diagnosed with it, it's like typically a lifelong condition. It's not something that necessarily goes into remission. And so it's hard to deal with. About 1 in 100 people have schizophrenia, and you can kind of see the brain scans there of people who may be at high risk. So there's definitely factors of like activity levels in the brain. People with schizophrenia going on because of the hallucinations and the delusions and things like that. Their brains look like that brain up there, more lit up, more active. We typically say people in their late teens and early 20s are one of the greatest ages of risk factors because that's when most cases manifest. It's kind of like when your brain stops fully developing in your like 20s, then we might start to see the onset of symptoms of schizophrenia. And then the other thing I want to make clear is this is not anything to do with multiple personalities. So make sure that you can differentiate between schizophrenia and what the media or what we hear as multiple personalities. And so the two big things that you need to be able to with schizophrenia is hallucinations and delusions. These are really the two big indicators of this disorder. And so hallucinations are false sensory experiences. I hear things that aren't there. I see things that aren't there. So someone with schizophrenia might hallucinate that spiders are coming out of the walls. That's a false sensory experience. They literally see spiders coming out of the wall. It's very scary and it's very traumatizing because to them, that's what they see happening, even though the rest of us don't see that. So you can imagine how traumatic having hallucinations like that would be. The most common hallucination that people with schizophrenia suffer from is hearing voices that aren't there. Excuse me. And sometimes these voices are not very nice. People who suffer from schizophrenia The voices might tell them to harm themselves. The voices might tell them to commit a crime. And just think about that, having someone being negative or telling you you're worthless all day, every day in your ear. You're hearing that. It's not there. People aren't actually hearing that, but you're experiencing that sensation. So that's the hallucination aspect. This can also then pair with delusions. Delusions are false thoughts. So someone might think they're Jesus or they're God. I am God. I am Jesus, because of their delusions. Another really common thing is the paranoia that comes with this. People are out to get me. My room is bugged. The government is listening in to my phone calls. Maybe true, but in this case, like extreme paranoia. And so the hallucinations kind of pair with the delusions, right? If I'm hearing voices in my head saying, oh, don't trust him, they're out to get you, be careful, like if that's the voices in my head, then it leads me to think these delusional thoughts that people are out to get me, my room is bugged, the government, things like that. So those kind of go together. So you really have to be able to differentiate between hallucinations, which are sensory, and delusions, which are thinking thought processes. So make sure that you understand the difference there. And those are the two, again, most common symptoms that we see manifest with schizophrenia. Again, we'll talk more about it in the therapy unit because it's treated typically with medication. But another reason why schizophrenia is so hard to treat is if someone's telling you every day to take a pill and you have delusions that people are out to get you, are you going to want to take that medication? Probably not. You're going to think someone's trying to control your mind or things like that. And so if people with schizophrenia aren't under constant medical care, it's really easy for them to go off their medications and then experience, setbacks with their disorder. And so again, another reason why it's really difficult to treat this disorder in particular. Again, if anytime you need me to re-explain something, or if you have, you can either throw it in the chat over here on the right, or there's an ask a question button at the bottom that like flags me when I'm talking. So the other thing with schizophrenia is that some symptoms are called positive and some are called negative. Positive symptoms of schizophrenia, first of all, does not mean good. There are no good things that come, no good symptoms that are going to come with schizophrenia. Positive means that we're adding, positive, an inappropriate behavior. So for example, of a positive symptom is the hallucinations. It's adding in this inappropriate or additional behavior that doesn't necessarily exist. Adding in inappropriate emotional reactions. So laughing at a funeral, that is adding in an inappropriate emotional response. Negative symptoms then, if positive is adding in, negative is the absence or the subtraction of appropriate behaviors. So sometimes people with schizophrenia have like a toneless voice. They talk completely monotone. They have no expression, no any sort of emotiveness. So their absence of that kind of appropriate emotional tone. So they have a toneless voice or no emotional expression. So that might be like a question on the test, like, which of these is an example of, a positive symptom? And then you have to identify which one where there's the addition of something in the scenario. And Peter is exactly right in the chat. It's just like positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Don't think good, don't think bad. We're adding in or we're subtracting appropriate or inappropriate behaviors. All right, good. So now we are moving on to somatic disorders. This is kind of an umbrella term as well. There's other categories that fall under it. The word somatic means bodily, and a somatic disorder is any sort of psychological disorder in which your symptoms take a bodily form without a physical cause. So maybe you're having like headaches or dizziness or fatigue or nausea. And it's usually these really like vague symptoms too. oh, I just feel kind of queasy. I don't feel very good. And right, we all feel that way once in a while. That's not somatic symptom disorder. Again, for this to be a disorder, it has to be consistent, it has to be disruptive, it has to be dysfunctional to our lives. So if it keeps happening, you're just getting headaches every single day, and you've been to the doctor and they've done brain scans and MRIs, and there's nothing wrong. Like, there's nothing wrong with you, with your body, but you're still feeling these headaches, then we might look at something like a somatic symptom disorder. And basically, it's kind of hypothesized that it's your body's way of like crying out for help and saying, like, I don't feel great psychologically. I want you to pay attention to me. So here are these vague symptoms like nausea or headaches to make you kind of stop and pay attention. This disorder is more common in Asian cultures, where in general, right, we're talking in general terms, physical illness is like, okay, that's accepted, but like mental illness isn't always as well accepted. And so instead of feeling like you're suffering from depression, you may ignore those symptoms, but then your body in response turns those symptoms into something somatic so that you pay attention and slow down and, oopsies, clicked on something on my screen. Okay, you slow down and kind of pay attention to what is happening. So those are all kind of vague sort of symptoms with no bodily cause, right? Freud is really interested in somatic disorders. That's kind of where he started his research, was like why people were experiencing some of these things. And then under somatic symptom disorder is something called conversion disorder. And so this is when you have a really specific physical symptom where there's no cause. So you literally might lose feeling in your left hand. It's just gone. It's there, you see it, you didn't injure it, you didn't slam it in a car door, you didn't break it, but you've lost feeling in your hand. Some people go blind. There's no physical cause. We can do an exam. Everything's normal with your eyes, with your optic nerve, with your brain. Everything's normal, but you literally would tell me, I can't see anything. And so a conversion disorder is basically when your anxiety, it's presumed as your anxiety, is converted into a very specific physical symptom. So somatic symptom disorder is kind of those vague, like, oh, I've got a headache, I'm nauseous. Conversion disorder is very specific. I can't feel my left hand. I've gone blind. And like I said, Freud is very interested in these things. If you've ever seen Talladega Nights with Will Ferrell, we can actually, let's just watch the clip. It's a good example of conversion disorder. I'm hoping that this plays. Let's go here. So if you've ever seen this movie, Will Ferrell gets in a car accident and thinks he's paralyzed. And so they're talking to him about this disorder. This is obviously like a Hollywood kind of clip related to this. It's not a super serious thing.
Ricky, the doctor told us that we should let you work it out in your own sweet time, but Ricky, you can walk. What'd you just say?
He's telling you the truth, man. It's all in your head.
You sick sons of bitches. I mean, you walk in that door on your two legs all fat and cocky, looking at me in my chair, and you tell me it's all in my head? I hope that both of you have sons, handsome, beautiful, articulate sons who are talented and star athletes, and they have their legs taken away. I mean, I pray you know that pain and that hurt. Don't you put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby. Don't you put that on us. You are not paralyzed. I am so paralyzed. No.
Rough on him now.
No, he needs to know.
Okay.
He's always crying.
Tough love it is, tough love. Wake up, idiot.
You want to know what I am? You want to see what my life is? Don't do it. You want to see what's going on here?
Don't you stick that knife in your leg.
You
All right, so obviously that's Hollywood's version, not super reliable, but it is an example of what they're trying to get at there as a conversion disorder. Obviously, we wouldn't recommend like yelling at someone with conversion disorder and telling them it's all in their head or things like that, unless you were like a trained therapist. But again, just an example of like in pop culture, how conversion disorder was shown or manifested in that case. So he genuinely felt like he was paralyzed, right? He was like, I can't walk. What are you saying? Whatever. And then it turned out that there was no actual physical cause for him to have experienced the paralysis. It was, psychological. All right. Another disorder that falls kind of under that somatic branch is illness anxiety disorder. If you've ever heard anyone being called a hypochondriac, that's the outdated term here. We now call it illness anxiety disorder. And basically someone with this psychological disorder interprets their normal sensations as like symptoms of a dreaded disease. People who are like Dr. Google, right? As soon as they have a headache, they're entering all their symptoms into WebMD and they're like, oh my gosh, it says I might have brain cancer. Or, oh my gosh, it says I might have stomach cancer just because I have a stomach ache. And so it's, I think we all do that once in a while, right? We kind of run with it. Oh my gosh, I haven't been feeling well. But the people who have illness anxiety disorder are consistently going to the doctor all of the time. They may even like doctor shop, like go from doctor to doctor to doctor to try and get a diagnosis. But basically it's just a misinterpretation. It's kind of anxiety related, right? Which is why it's called illness anxiety disorder, that every little thing, every little bump, every little ache, every little pain might be signifying some actually really bad, scary disease, when we know that that is typically not the case. So that is another example of a somatic kind of disorder. And then now we are moving on to dissociative disorders. And this is, we have two more kind of categories to go over. Dissociative disorders are when we lose our conscious awareness. It kind of like we separate ourselves from our conscious awareness. This is really, really rare. And typically we don't, like therapists could go their whole lives without like seeing cases of this necessarily. You may actually like lose complete memory or change your identity in response to an overwhelming or stressful situation. So you've literally dissociated, you've split your like old self to this new self, and you've completely forgotten the in-between. And it's like your body or your brain's way of psychologically dealing with that stress and with that trauma. It's just like, nope, fresh start, we're starting over. And so people with dissociative disorders may experience amnesia. They may go into a fugue state. That's when you actually just like get up, go, and leave, and you leave your whole life behind and you kind of forget about it and you just start fresh somewhere else. We all kind of dissociate in one way or another, just as like some minor examples. If you've ever like really been absorbed in a book and all of a sudden it's 2 hours later and you kind of lost track of time, or when you daydream and you're not really paying attention until someone like snaps you out of it. Those are examples of like minor dissociations that we all experience. You kind of lose your present focus. Those are not psychological disorders, right? For it to be a psychological disorder, again, it has to be this long-lasting dysfunctional thing. But those are just kind of examples to maybe give you a little bit of an understanding about what that dissociation means and looks like. And so the big disorder here that goes with this is called dissociative identity disorder. And this is what used to be called multiple personality disorders. So I'm sure like on Law and Order, I know there was a case about someone with multiple personality disorder. We don't use that terminology. We call it dissociative identity disorder. And that is when you have a massive dissociation from your ordinary consciousness, and you actually may have multiple identities that pop out. And so it's theorized that like each identity alternately controls who you are to help you cope or to help you deal with whatever the stressful thing happening in your life is. So you may have you could have personalities that are different genders, different ages, things like that. And they, depending on the person, they may come and go frequently. You can actually sometimes call one out versus the other. There's a new show on A&E. Oh gosh, I can't remember what it's called now. That is highlighting, it's a documentary following around a woman who claims to have dissociative identity disorder. I do say claims only because some therapists question the authenticity of this disorder. Some therapists argue that it's more of just like a role-playing sort of thing, but it's conscious, that you're not actually like switching personalities. It's more of you consciously doing it. And if it was truly a dissociative thing, you would not consciously be aware of the flipping between personalities. Others saw a rise when therapists started really becoming interested in this disorder, that basically therapists were kind of like fishing for it and trying to make it happen more so than it had in the past. And then the other evidence sort of that make people question if this is a real disorder is that it tends to be a cultural phenomenon, right? We see it on our TV shows all the time. We see it in movies all the time. But like in other cultures where they don't have that sort of media focus on it, the cases are much lower and much more rare. So it could be a cultural phenomenon, or it could be something that we kind of play into. There is also, though, support for the fact that it's a disorder, and it is considered a disorder. It's in the DSM and things like that. I'm just making you aware of kind of the both sides of the debate, is that when people are in one personality versus another, different parts of their brain are active. And so it is literally seeming like they're switching from one person to another because different parts of their brain all of a sudden switch on and off as one person versus the other. And the most famous case, if you're interested in this at all, is Chris Costner-Sizemore. And we'll watch a short clip of her. It's an older video. It's a documentary. She's being interviewed by her therapist, but they made a whole movie about her called something about Eve. I'm gonna oopsies. And so we can watch just a clip so you can see. Maybe, why is my link not working? Shoot. Eve. You can Google her name. The documentary is called The Three. There's an actual like Hollywood movie called The Three Faces of Eve. And then there's the, oh, there's the link. Thank you. Here we go. And this isn't scary, I promise. There's nothing like weird that's going to happen.
Are you feeling well these days?
Tired.
Feel tired? You felt tired for some time, haven't you? I see. You hope and expect this will all soon be terminated. How do you feel about that?
I think Jane will be the one.
You feel that she will be the one? How do you feel personally about it?
Something that's got to be. I want to get well, and if that's the only way to get well, that's the way I want it.
So he's discussing with her which personality, if he cures her, would stay around.
Does it cause you distress?
In a way, I worry about Sarah.
You feel that she may not be taken care of? Do you regret going, or what's your feeling about it?
No, I'm tired.
Could I speak with Eve Black now?
Sure.
Eve Black? Right there.
I don't know.
enjoy the trip overseas?
Yeah. It was disappointing, though, wasn't it?
Was it?
Yeah, you know, I thought we just through space and then we were just creeping along like a little castle. I didn't even feel like I was.
That's your first time being there. How do you like all this?
I think it's real exciting.
Do you?
Don't you?
Very interesting.
I guess it is interesting in a way. I think it's more exciting than interesting.
How long have you been out? How long?
So the argument here, then, you can tell that, right, the first Eve seemed to be much more shy and quiet and kind of leaning forward and didn't seem very outgoing. And then when we switched to the other Eve, she was like, oh yeah, this is fun, I'm happy, I'm like a completely different person. And so the argument there is that those are genuinely two different personalities, that her brain or her psychologically, she dissociates from one to the other depending on the scenario or the situation. So that is basically an example then of what dissociative identity disorder would look like. Really briefly, I don't know if your books touch on eating disorders. Basically, I just want you to know that there's some genetic influence at play, and that culture also plays a big factor in who develops eating disorders, depending on the media where you live, like the messages that you receive from not only television, but like Instagram, Snapchat, things like that. And then also us that live in like a Western style culture are much more susceptible to eating disorders. I'm not going to talk through all of the disorders because I think you get that in health class typically, but for the AP test, you should be able to recognize like bulimia, anorexia, and also obesity, and binge eating as a disorder, not obesity, sorry. So just recognize those disorders. All right, the last category then for tonight is personality disorders. Personality disorders then are basically what they sound like. It's like you have a personality, some sort of impairment on social functioning. It's disruptive, it's inflexible, it's an enduring behavior. It's your personality, it's a part of who you are that impairs your functioning. And there's three basic groupings here of personality disorders. There's an anxious/fearful kind of grouping of personality disorders. There's ones that we would call odd or eccentric. And then there's those that are dramatic and impulsive. And so I grabbed this chart out of the Myers textbook. That's the textbook that I use with my students. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because that could be like a whole lecture on its own, but I would highly recommend screenshotting it or taking a picture of it because it organizes all of the different disorders really well. So you see them by cluster. All of the anxious ones are listed at the top. It tells you the names of the disorders, and then it also tells you a description and what percent we see as being male or female, which I think is interesting. Some of them are 50-50, and some of them sway much more heavily to one gender over the other. Typically speaking, the most common one that you should know for the AP test is antisocial personality disorder, although really I think any of these could pop up on the test. I think it's kind of unlikely though, because I don't lecture on these at all. I just like show my students this, have them kind of look at them and see if you can at least just kind of understand the general emphasis. Some of the ones that I do talk about, like histrionic personality disorder, people who are overly dramatic, people who exaggerate, things like that, kind of over the top. And then, yeah, antisocial personality disorder is the one that is the most common one to show up. So if you're going to study any, that would be the one. And so antisocial personality disorder is when a person who's usually a man, if you saw in the last slide, 82% of people who have APD, antisocial personality disorder, are men. And basically the characteristic of this is someone who exhibits a lack of conscience, even towards friends and family. So if you ever hear on like a TV show when they're like, he's a psychopath or he's a sociopath, that's what they're talking about. Those are former terms. We don't use those as like technical terms in psychology, but that's what that's referencing, is someone with antisocial personality disorder. Typically, what we could see here is these people are really aggressive. They will hurt their family just as much as they may hurt a random stranger, and they don't feel bad about it. That's really the key here, is like, I'm going to do a bad thing and I don't care because I'm only looking out for myself, and I don't care about others. And so they fear very little. They show not very much mercy, and they don't care about violating the rights of others. And so we often, I think when we hear like sociopath or psychopath, we think of like a serial killer, but like, not all people with antisocial personality disorder are serial killers. There's people who are really ruthless con artists. You know, think about the people who call up your grandma and grandpas and steal their identity and take their life savings. They don't feel bad about it, and they do it day after day after day. Those may be people that we might consider having antisocial personality traits. We can identify early signs of this in children as young as 3. I watch a lot of Criminal Minds. Some of it's true, some of it's exaggerated, but we can see that people who are impulsive at a really early age, uninhibited, kids who don't care about social rewards at all, or like kind of that fitting in sort of thing, and people who have low anxiety. Because think about it, if you didn't care what anyone thought about you and hurting anyone's feelings or anything like that, you probably wouldn't feel anxious about much, because who cares? I'm looking out for me and I'm going to do what's best for myself. 3 serial killers that have been identified as having antisocial personality disorder are Ted Bundy, Dennis Rader, and Henry Lee Lucas. So it is a common trait. I think you'd have to have some sort of careless attitude towards people to murder a bunch of people. But just because you have, you're going to be a serial killer, it can manifest in other forms and other ways. So what makes someone a sociopath, right, in that sort of cultural term? We've looked into it, right? We try to figure out how can we screen when someone is going to end up being the next Jeffrey Dahmer or things like that. And we know that there is some genetic factors at play that predispose certain people to crime, but there is no like killer gene. I think we see that sometimes on like Criminal Minds. They're like, oh, the killer gene. That's not a real thing. There's certain combinations of genetic factors that can maybe predispose someone to be more aggressive or more violent, but there's no singular gene that we can like pinpoint to someone having this sort of disorder. We also know that poverty and familial instability can cause some of these factors to manifest themselves. And so really, just like everything that we talk about in here, there's the bio factors, the psychological factors, and the social factors. The biopsychosocial approach is really the key to understanding any disorder. All right, and I just have a few examples here for you. I don't know if you want to just read through them, but Joseph, how about I'll read the first one, and in the chat, if you feel like you know it, you can put it in the chat. You're just identifying which disorder you think it is. I have 7 of these, and then that's it for tonight. So number 1, Joseph pretended to be raising money for a charitable organization. He collected thousands of dollars from his family and friends, but spent the money on a trip to the Bahamas. He felt no remorse. What disorder could we categorize that as? Throw it in the chat when you think you know it. I'll give you like 20 more seconds, and then I'm just going to say it. So that is a antisocial personality disorder, right? He's being ruthless and mean, and he doesn't feel bad about it. Number 2, Annie becomes dizzy and nauseous in the late afternoon, shortly before she expects her husband home. Neither her physician nor the neurologist could identify a physical cause. What is Annie possibly suffering from? And obviously these are very short snippets. They're not inclusive of everything, but she's dizzy and nauseous. There's no physical cause. Yes, exactly. It is somatic symptom disorder. It's those vague general symptoms that we see with no necessary cause. This one is from last time, or maybe you'll just be able to identify it. But George, a Vietnam veteran, is haunted by his comrade's death. He disappeared en route to work this is from today, sorry. Disappeared en route to work one day and was discovered 6 months later in Chicago homeless shelter with no memory of his identity or family. What is George suffering from? So he's having a stressful psychological disappearance, and all of a sudden he disappeared and has woken up with no memory of who he is or his prior life. Yep, exactly. Dissociative fugue makes sense. He's dissociated. He's split his personality from his previous life, and he's also like gone. He's like disappeared, gone away, and started a brand new life. 4, I don't know why there's a 5 there. Kathy, a high school gymnast, lost sensation in one of her legs right before the conference meet. She indicated that she felt fine and was not stressed about the competition. Kathy was unable to compete because of her leg. What is Kathy suffering from? So there's no injury to her leg, but for some reason she's lost that feeling. What disorder could we categorize that as? So I'm going to give that one, that's conversion disorder. So again, there's no physical cause. She says she feels fine. I'm fine, totally fine. But the symptoms are manifesting themselves in a physical way. In this case, it's a very specific thing. I can't feel my leg. All right. I'm going to skip 5 because it's one of the personality disorders that I did not discuss in depth. But if you are reading it, it's histrionic personality disorder. Number 6. Harry experienced sadistic abuse as a child. His family reports that it's almost as if Harry is 2 different people. On some occasions, he is supportive and caring, and on others, he is verbally abusive towards others. What could Harry's possibly be? And as you're thinking about that, I just want to, again, stress, right? If we're diagnosing someone for real, we're going to have a lot more background info. But these are the sorts of questions that you might get on a test. And so just being able to identify them off of these snippets is really crucial. Bree, you are exactly right. It is dissociative identity disorder. It seems like he's 2 different people. He acts one way, then he acts another. And then lastly, Lori is concerned about her health. Just yesterday, she experienced an intense headache while at work. Today, she feels a bit out of it. Lori wonders if she might need to go to a neurologist to get checked for a brain tumor. So she's got this headache for a day, and now she thinks, might be a brain tumor. Better get it checked out. What is we got going on here? Exactly, yes, Anna. Illness, anxiety disorder, that is correct. So we are at our hour cap, and I want to kind of respect everybody's time. I did not get a chance tonight to do the FRQ, so I will carry that over to next week. So next week we'll start with a practice FRQ. We're going to work on that part A, part B thing, just to make sure we're all used to that. And then as a reminder, next week we're doing therapy. Please make sure if you want to have access to all of the old sessions that you're subscribing to 500 Plus. As it's getting down to kind of the nitty gritty, you might want to go back and review some previous sessions, so you can do that through 500 Plus. Always make sure to register and follow our Facebook pages and get updates on our information. So I will see you guys next week. Have a great day.